Fellas, in the context of MMA, Dagestan is kind of seen as this region of the world that just keeps producing these monsters, from the Khabib to Makhachev to Umar and Magomedov. I'm going to be ranking every single Dagestani fighter currently signed to the UFC. Now, this is just going to be purely active fighters. The likes of Khabib and Zabit ain't going to be in this video, so it's just going to be active Dagestani fighters. I'm going to be ranking every single one that's currently, signed to the UFC from worst to best to kind of get an idea of how good they are and who's the best, who the worst is. And we'll start off with last place with number 15th with the worst current Dagestani fighter signed to the UFC. And I've gone with Abubakar Nurmagomedov. Now, this dude's got a record of 17 wins and 4 losses. He's actually the cousin of Khabib Nurmagomedov. If we look at his MMA career before the UFC, went on a decent streak outside the UFC, ended up losing until he got signed to PFL. And then in PFL, he went 1-1-1, 1 win, 1 draw, 1 loss. Then he gets signed to the UFC, and he's gone 2-2 in the UFC so far, yet to get a finish. Lost his last fight by decision all the way back in June of 2023 against Zaleski dos Santos. So, considering he's not fought since June of 2023 and he has lost to Zaleski dos Santos in his last fight, I can't really put him anything higher than number 15th. He's not done anything in the UFC so far. I don't even know if I consider him really active anymore, considering he hasn't fought in so long. So, last place, I'm going to go with Abubakar Nurmagomedov as the worst Dagestani currently signed to the UFC. And number 14th, I'm going to go with Magomed Gadzhizulov. Now, this dude's fairly new to the UFC. He's got an MMA record of 9 wins and 0 losses. As you'd expect, good career outside the UFC. Got a win in Eagle FC, which is Khabib's promotion. Then he got signed to Dana White's Contender Series. Got a decision on the Contender Series, followed up by a decision win on, I think it was UFC Abu Dhabi against Brenton Ribeiro. So he's had 1 win on the Contender Series, 1 win in the UFC, he's 9-0. But the fact that he's not really beaten any notable name yet, like, we don't really know how good this dude is. He's not fought anyone that's really good. I mean, to be fair, Brenton Ribeiro, who he beat in his UFC debut, won last night, to be fair, but it was a bit of a bad fight. But anyway, Gadzhizulov, we need to see how good he is. He's only 9-0. He's not fought anyone good yet, so I can't really put him anything higher than 14th. And number 13th, I'm going to go with Muslim Salikov. Now, Muslim Salikov got a record of 20 wins and 5 losses. One of the few Dagestanis that actually chooses to strike because he comes from a Kung Fu background. If we look at his career before the UFC, this dude was on an absolute tear from 2013 to 2017. This dude was just finishing people left, right, and center. Actually loses his UFC debut by finish, but then after that goes on a bit of a winning streak, 5-fight winning streak. But now he's lost 3 out of his last 5. He did get a win over Santiago Ponzinibbio in his last fight, a close fight over Ponzinibbio, and he's had some really good knockouts, and he's a pretty good striker as well, is Muslim Salikov. He's not just one of these cans that, he's terrible in the UFC, but to be fair, he has lost 3 out of his last 5. He's 40 years old, and I don't think he's going to make it into the welterweight rankings, considering he has lost to Randy Brown and he's lost to Nicolas Dalby. So Muslim Salikov, I'll put him at number 13th. Had some good wins, Zaleski dos Santos, Ponzinibbio, Andre Fialho. Had some losses, Nicolas Dalby, Randy Brown, Li Jingliang, but I can't really put him anything higher than 13th. I don't think he becomes ranked. I don't think he's got this big potential in the UFC. He's a good striker. He's not a can. But I just think he's going to be one of these guys that we see on the prelim of like a fight night or a pay-per-view every now and then. So at number 13th, I'm going to go with Muslim Salikov. At number 12, I'm going to go with the meal deal, Shamil Gaziev. Now, Shamil Gaziev got a record of 13 wins, 1 loss. Had a good run outside the UFC, as you'd expect. Gets picked up by the Contender Series. Gets a good finish in his Contender Series fight. And then he goes to the UFC. Finishes Martin Badai, which has actually aged really well because Martin Badai has been able to beat everyone he's been put against in the UFC apart from Shamil Gaziev. So that's actually aged quite well. Gets a fight night main event against Rosenstrike. Ends up getting battered by Rosenstrike. Gets finished in that fight, but it was a massive step up. And then he picked up a good win in his last fight against Dontel Mayer. So he's a good grappler, Shamil Gaziev. And I do think he's got potential to make it into the heavyweight rankings, considering it's pretty easy to make it into the heavyweight rankings. I can see him beating somebody like Naskimento or Romanov, but he is yet to get that big win. I mean, he's had some wins over Martin Badai and Dontel Mays. He's lost to Rosenstrike. He needs to get that another big win. He's not ranked yet. I'll put him at number 12. So at number 12, I will go with Shamil Gaziev. At number 11, I'm going to go with Said Nurmagomedov. Now, he's not actually related to Khabib. A lot of people think because he's got the last name Nurmagomedov, that automatically means he's related to Khabib. He's not related to Khabib, but he's got a record of 18 wins and 3 losses. Good run outside the UFC, had 1 loss as well outside the UFC. Comes over to the UFC, wins his first 2 fights. Then he loses to Barcelos. Then he goes on a bit of a winning streak. And then eventually, in his past couple of fights, his past 6 fights, his only loss has been to Jonathan Martinez, who's ranked. And that was actually a really close fight with Jonathan Martinez as well. And I do think he's got potential to make it to the bantamweight rankings too. I mean, like I said, he had a close fight with Jonathan Martinez. I think he could beat someone like Kyler Phillips or Montel Jackson to make it into the rankings. And he's actually fairly well-rounded. He's got a really good Dorsch choke. He's a really good submission artist, but he's also quite good on the feet as well. So, Said Nurmagomedov, I'll put him at number 11. His only notable fight is a loss to Jonathan Martinez, but apart from that, he's pretty talented. I think he's got a good future. So, I'll put Said Nurmagomedov at number 11. And number 10, I'm going to go with Abbas Magomedov. Abbas Magomedov, record of 27 wins and 6 losses. Massive career outside the UFC, ends up losing 3 times outside the UFC, then gets picked up to the PFL. Goes on a bit of a run in PFL until his last PFL fight where he gets knocked out cold. Then he gets signed to the well, actually before he got signed to the UFC, went on a 2-fight winning streak. Then he gets signed to the UFC, knocks out Dustin Stoltzfus in his UFC debut, gets a massive step up in a Fight Night main event against Sean Strickland, gets finished by Strickland in the second round. Then he also loses to Barallo, but in his past two, he's on a 2-fight winning streak, and recently at UFC 3, he beat Bruno Ferreira. So if we look at his notable wins and losses, his best win is Bruno Ferreira. Shut down the prospect of Bruno Ferreira by finishing him recently at UFC 308. And to be fair, even though he has lost twice in the UFC, he's lost to Strickland, who's number 1, and Barallo, who's number 5. So he's only really lost to the best middleweights in the world. So I'll put Abus Magomedov at number 10. Fairly talented, could make it into the rankings. We still need to see how he does against someone else. And he's not flawless either. He has got gas tank issues. He's a little bit chinny, but I'll put Magomedov at number 10. At number 9, I'm going to go with Roman Kopylov. Now, Roman Kopylov got a record of 13 wins and 3 losses. Massive streak outside of the UFC. Apart from his MMA debut, this dude was just straight finishing people outside the UFC. Loses his first 2 fights in the UFC to Robertson and then goes to a decision loss as well. And then he goes on a 4-fight winning streak just sleeping people and was kind of labelled as this big middleweight prospect. Really good kickboxer, knocking people out, finishing people, great combinations, this big striking prospect in the middleweight division, until he runs into Anthony Hernandez at UFC 298, gets finished by Hernandez, but in his last fight at 302 picked up a win over Cesar Almeida. I do think he's got potential to make it into the middleweight rankings. He's got a fight booked against Chris Curtis, and even though Chris Curtis isn't ranked, I think if he can get past Chris Curtis, he'll probably make it into the rankings, or at least get a shot at the rankings after that. So I'll go with Roman Kopylov at number 9. His notable wins, Cesar Almeida. His notable losses, Albert Duraev, Carl Robertson, Anthony Hernandez. But yeah, if he keeps it up, if he beats Chris Curtis, he'll probably get ranked. So I'll put him at number 9. If he improves his stamina and take down the fence as well, he's going to be a bit of a dangerous fighter. Number 7, I'm going to go with, number 8, I'm going to go with Azamat Murzakanov. Now, Azamat Murzakanov, undefeated at 14-0 in the UFC. Big streak outside the UFC, gets picked up by the Contender Series, gets a finish on the Contender Series, and then goes on a 4-fight winning streak. And he had some pretty brutal finishes in the UFC so far. He's very dangerous on the feet. He is actually ranked as well in the light heavyweight division, unlike everyone else in this list so far. He's ranked number 11. He's going to be fighting Nikita Krylov in his next fight. If we look at his notable wins and losses, well, he's never lost. His notable wins are Dustin Jacoby and Alonzo Menifield. Yeah, Azamat Murzakanov, I'm going to put him at number 9. He's ranked unlike everyone else in this list. He's undefeated. He's very, very dangerous on the feet. He's Murzakanov. Not perfect. Has a bit of a gas tank issue, but if he can get past Nikita Krylov, he's only going to be a fight or 2 away from a title shot in the light heavyweight division. So I'll put Azamat Murzakanov at number 8. Good prospect in the light heavyweight division. I just think we need to see a little bit more from him before I put him above number 8. At number 7, I'm going to go with Ikram Aliskerov. Now, Ikram Aliskerov, he's 15-2 in his two losses. You know, they're against some of the best in the world. Outside the UFC, straight beast. His only loss was to Chimaev, who is obviously a top 3 middleweight in the world right now. Wins on the Contender Series and on the UFC. Goes on a 4-fight winning streak, knocking out Phil Hawes, beating Wally Alves as well. A couple other finishes. Then he gets a massive step up in the main event against Robert Whittaker and gets knocked out in the exact same way he did against Chimaev by an uppercut against Whittaker. If we look at his notable wins and losses, he beat Phil Hawes, which was quite good. Ends up losing to Chimaev and Whittaker. So his only notable losses are against 2 top 5 middleweights in the world. So you can't really blame him for the guys he's lost to, but he is very well rounded. I think he's got still got massive potential in the UFC. Really well rounded, great striker. Well, not great striker, but dangerous striker, dangerous grappler. And I think that fight with Whittaker would have given the experience he needed. So I'll put Ikram Aliskerov at number 7. A lot of potential, but he's not really had that highlight win yet in the UFC. At number 6, I'm going to go with Shara Bullet Magomedov. Now, Shara Bullet Magomedov undefeated at 15-0. Big streak outside the UFC, was kind of hopping from MMA to kickboxing to Muay Thai. And wins his UFC debut by battering Bruno Silva. Then gets his next 2 wins against Antonio Chikoli and Mikal. And then in his last fight, got a brutal KO against Umar Petrosian at UFC 308, which in my opinion is one of the best knockouts this year, and he's now managed to make it into the rankings of the middleweight division as well. Personally, I'm not sure he deserves a ranking spot, but he is ranked, and I'm not going to complain about it too much. Now, he's not flawless either. He has got grappling issues. He got out-grappled by Mikal. He got out-grappled by Bruno Silva in his UFC debut, so I think the extent to how far he can go in the UFC really just depends on how much he improves his grappling, but he's had some good wins, finished Umar Petrosian brutally, battered Bruno Silva, and he's now ranked in the middleweight division as well, so I'll put Shara Bullet Magomedov at number 6, one of my personal favourite Dagestani fighters, one of the only Dagestani fighters in the world that can't grapple, but yeah, he's a good striking prospect, fun to watch. I'll put him at number 6. At number 5, I'm going to go with Movsar Evloev. Now, Evloev, perfect record at 18-0, undefeated. Good streak outside the UFC. Now, he had only 3 decision wins outside the UFC, which wasn't great at foreshadowing his UFC career, because in the UFC, he's yet to finish a single fighter. He's had a bunch of wins in the UFC, but hasn't finished anyone so far, but he has had some good wins. Beat Arnold Allen, beat Diego Lopez, beat Dan Ige. And he is in the top 5 as well in the featherweight ranking. So he's not just ranked, but he's top 5. He's got a fight booked with Aljamain Sterling. You've got to think that if he beats Sterling, he might be fighting for a belt or at least in a #1 contender fight in his next fight. Now, he has had some close fights. He almost lost to Diego Lopez on like 2 days' notice for Lopez. And a lot of people thought Arnold Allen should have beat him in as well. So he's not completely flawless. But the fact that he has been able to get past Diego Lopez, Arnold Allen, Dan Ige, he's 18-0 undefeated. And he's in the top 5 of the featherweight division. And I think he's a favourite going into this fight with Sterling as well. You've got to give him the credit and respect he deserves. So Movsar Evloev, I'm going to put him at number 5 as the 5th best Dagestani in the UFC right now. And number 4, I'm going to go with Nassourdine Imavov. I always get debated on whether Imavov's actually Dagestani or not. Some people think he's French. He is technically he's a French citizen, but he comes from Dagestan. That's where he was originally born and where he originally came from. So I'm counting him as a Dagestani fighter. In terms of his record, he's got a record of 15 wins and 4 losses. Bit of a streak outside the UFC. Did lose a few times outside the UFC. Went 1-1 in his first 2 fights in the UFC. Goes on a 3-fight winning streak. Then he gets, including a win over Buckley. Then he ends up losing to Sean Strickland. And then he gets a no contest to Chris Curtis. But after that, he's gone on a 3-fight winning streak, which is quite impressive. He's now ranked top 5 as well, just like Evloev in the middleweight division. He has had 4 losses, though, so I can't really rank him any higher considering he has had 4 losses. And he's not completely flawless either. I mean, Brendan Allen was beating him in that first round, but he is top 5 in the middleweight division. And he has had some good wins. Beating Roma Delite, finishing Jared Cannonier, and beating Brendan Allen as well when Allen was on a streak as well. So he's had some good wins. He's only like a fight or 2 away from a title shot. He's also beaten Buckley as well, another one of his notable wins. And his only losses are to Phil Hawes and Sean Strickland when Hawes was a bit of a prospect and Strickland's number 1 in the middleweight division. So I'll put him above at number 4 as the 4th best Dagestan in the UFC. A fight away from a title shot. Very talented. He's had some good wins in the middleweight division. So I'll put him at number 4. At number 3, the 3rd best Dagestani in the UFC, I'm going to go with Magomed Ankalaev. Now, Ankalaev has got a record of 20 wins and 1 loss. Big streak outside the UFC. Lost his UFC debut to Paul Craig. I still can't believe that out of everyone to beat Ankalaev and Jamal Hill before Poeton, it was Paul Craig of all people. But after the loss to Paul Craig, goes on an absolute tear in the UFC, gets a title shot against Jan Blachowicz in which he had a draw. I thought he should have won that fight, but it ended in a draw. Then he had his no contest against Johnny Walker, but now he's on a 2-fight winning streak, knocked out Johnny Walker, beat Rakic as well. He's now number 1 ranked in the light heavyweight division. And he's actually got quite a good resume as well in the light heavyweight division. He's beaten Rakic, Uzdemir, Walker, Smith. So he's actually had quite a good run in the light heavyweight division. He's not flawless. I mean, he's not the best striker. He's getting absolutely pieced apart by Jan Blachowicz on the feet. But he's going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight, unlike everyone else on this list so far. So Ankalaev, notable wins, Rakic, Walker, Krylov, Uzdemir, Smith, and his only notable losses to Paul Craig. So I'll put him at number 3 as the 3rd best Dagestani. I personally don't think he's going to beat Poeton, but again, we can't really, say for sure yet. He's had some good wins in the light heavyweight division. He's got a really good resume. Ranked number 1, only lost once, 20 wins. I'm going to put Ankalaev at number 3 as the 3rd best Dagestani in the UFC. At number 2, I'm going to go with Umar Nurmagomedov. Now, Umar Nurmagomedov, 18-0, another perfect record, undefeated, obviously the cousin of Khabib as well. It seems to be anyone that trains with Khabib and all those guys. Like if you actually train in Khabib's camp, they tend to be absolute monsters. I mean, you've got Usman Nurmagomedov, you've got Umar Nurmagomedov, you've got Islam Makhachev. These guys just tend to be monsters. And he's a monster before the UFC, as you'd expect. Absolute streak. Ended up fighting twice on PFL before the UFC as well. Comes over to the UFC, wins his first 2 fights by submission. Then he goes on another 3-fight winning streak. And then he gets a massive step up against Corey Sandhagen, where he looked really good against Sandhagen, beat Sandhagen. But yeah, 18-0, undefeated. He's top 3 right now in the bantamweight division. He's probably going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight against Merab. And I actually think he beats Merab and he's going to be a future champion. So Umar Nurmagomedov, best win, only had 1 notable win over Corey Sandhagen. But the win over Sandhagen is a massive win in itself. I mean, even though he's only had 1 notable win, it's still a massive win. He's top 3 in the bantamweight division. Going to be fighting for a belt in his next fight. So at number 2, the 2nd best Dagestani in the world. You've got to give it to Umar Nurmagomedov. Personally think he's going to be a future champion. Hasn't lost yet in the octagon. Had a really good win over Sandhagen. You can't really deny him. And then at number 1, without any questions really needed, it's got to be Islam Makhachev. I mean, this dude 26-1 as a record. Big streak outside the UFC. Comes over to the UFC, wins his UFC debut. Then gets knocked out, which is only lost in his MMA career by Adriano Martins, the only guy to ever beat Makhachev. Makhachev took that personally, goes on this massive winning streak. I mean, he's had some of the best wins in the UFC, knocking out Volkanovski and taking him to a decision in his prime. Submitting Dustin Poirier in his most recent fight, submitting the submission artist in Charles Oliveira when Oliveira was on a run. He's pound for pound number 1 in the world. He's the lightweight champion. Not only is he pound for pound, not only is he the best Dagestani fighter, but he's the best fighter right now in the UFC. If we look at his, notable wins, I mean, the list just goes on. Beating Charles Oliveira, Volk twice, Poirier, Hooker, green door. But this dude's had, I think he's got one of the best resumes right now in the lightweight division, and his only loss is to Adriano Martins. So Islam Makhachev, he's not just the best Dagestani, but he's the best entirety in the UFC, which just kind of tells you how far he's gone. So at number 1, the best Dagestani in the UFC, I'm going to go with Makhachev, but that is how I would rank every single Dagestani currently signed to the UFC. Let me know your thoughts on this list, if you agree, disagree, if you think anyone should have been changed, but let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.